Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com. And this week I'm delighted to introduce a very special guest on our show. Again, we have some amazing guests week after week. And this week we have Dr. Lee Honigberg, who is the Vice President of Research and Development at ALZpath. Now, ALZpath is a provider of diagnostic tools for Alzheimer's disease, and this includes a blood-based biomarker assay called the ALZpathDx Diagnostic assay, which measures p-tau217 in the blood. And this assay is being used, or this biomarker assay is being used by big companies in the field, including Roche. And so we're very excited to learn more about it with Dr. Honigberg. Dr. Honigberg was most recently Senior Director and Distinguished Scientist in Translational Medicine at Genentech, where he was leading a group responsible for biomarker development for programs in neuroscience, ophthalmology, cardiovascular, and metabolic disease. Prior to Genentech, Dr. Honigberg was at Pharmacyclics and led the preclinical development of the BTK inhibitor ibrutinib, which was the first approved BTK inhibitor establishing a new standard of treatment in CLL. Dr. Honigberg's contributions were recognized by the 2019 ACS Heroes in Chemistry Award. Dr. Honigberg received a PhD in neuroscience from the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. To hear more about Dr. Honigberg's work at ALZpath and how he is leading really biomarker discovery development in Alzheimer's disease, let's turn to him now. Dr. Honigberg, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start off by asking you what really led and so to say, inspired you to pursue a career in drug development and particularly in the field of Alzheimer's disease. As we know, this is a very challenging disease area, and we've been hearing a lot of developments in the field, and ALZpath has been at the helm of some of them. So can you describe your journey into this area?
Yeah, it's a sort of strange journey. When I got out of college, I started out as a software engineer, and I was interested in artificial intelligence. And at that time, I thought a good way to sort of work on that would be to study neuroscience. My grandmother had Alzheimer's disease, and I had seen sort of firsthand how devastating the disease is and how hard it was on my parents and my aunt, who had to, not only watch the decline, but also figure out how to take care of her. And so I would say sort of both of those things led me to go to graduate school in neuroscience. I did very basic science. I went into biotech after grad school to continue to work in basic science. And then through my career at the first company and then the second company, I moved more towards the clinic and found that I really enjoyed translation. So, connecting from basic science into clinical trials and drug development and getting kind of closer to patients. So I worked, as you mentioned in the intro, I worked on a BTK inhibitor and really became to appreciate the importance of biomarkers. Then I went to Genentech to get back to neuroscience. I built a group there to do biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases, and then also ophthalmology. And learned a lot about clinical development and all the challenges we have in diagnosis and figuring out how to dose drugs and which patients to treat, and how to tell if drugs are working in early trials. So that was a great experience. One of the first things I worked on at Genentech was a clinical trial in Colombia in familial Alzheimer's disease. So. And that was all started by the Alzheimer's Prevention Institute at the Banner Institute, and Eric Ryman was one of the leaders of that, and I got to know Eric. And so last summer, Eric reached out to me about ALZpath, and so that is kind of my connection into ALZpath. And I knew that ALZpath was a leader in diagnosis for Alzheimer's disease and had this unique antibody and was committed towards access for patients and working towards prevention. So it's kind of been this journey for me from an early interest in neuroscience to getting more and more clinical and more focused on Alzheimer's disease and solving diagnostic problems.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that journey. And it's very interesting that you come across actually a good number of people who come from engineering backgrounds. And I think it's just that mindset of building things and solving problems that translates well into biomedical science as well. So very, very interesting path to ALZpath indeed. And so could you give us an overview of ALZpath's mission and core goals and really its approach to addressing Alzheimer's disease from a diagnostic perspective?
Yeah, I think you can summarize the ALZpath mission very concisely, as trying to improve the lives of patients with Alzheimer's disease or patients at risk of Alzheimer's disease through better diagnosis. And so, I think as most folks know, Alzheimer's is defined by two hallmark pathologies, amyloid plaques and tau tangles in the brain. And for many years, those could only be detected at autopsy through pathology. About 15 years ago, both tests looking in cerebrospinal fluid as well as PET scans using ligands that bind to amyloid plaque made it possible to detect those pathologies in living patients. But CSF and PET have certain disadvantages in that they're expensive or invasive and burdensome to patients. And so for a long time, people have been trying to find out if, for example, you could find the tests that work in CSF, can you get them to work in blood? And there was much research in this area. And a few years ago, one particular form of tau that's phosphorylated at position 217, so we call it p-tau 217, the levels of that are increased in blood in patients who have amyloid pathology as shown by a PET scan or a CSF test. And so that, there are a lot of possible markers that could be used in blood. p-tau 217 shows, maybe a 2 to 3-fold increase in patients with amyloid. So it has a bigger dynamic range there and is able to be more robust for the detection of amyloid pathology. And then what ALZpath has is a particular antibody that works very well at detecting p-tau 217 using an immunoassay. So an ELISA in which you capture with our antibody the p-tau that's 217 that's in blood, and then come in with a second antibody that gives you greater specificity and allows you to see this 2 to 3-fold difference in patients with and without amyloid pathology. So our approach is to use that and get it out to as many people as possible and improve the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And then we want to build on that and address the unmet needs in Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm. And I think this ties into sort of the last question in terms of what really differentiates ALZpath's R&D efforts from very many others in the field. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I gather is that I feel ALZpath has a very focused sort of approach, whereas we hear about a lot of different biomarkers, blood-based or CSF or PET biomarkers in the Alzheimer's space. And so it can get a bit overwhelming. But what I'm hearing is that p-tau 217 is something that is worth that solitary focus.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, it's interesting to see how the field, has evolved and will continue to evolve. People need to try lots of different markers and test them out in various ways. And then occasionally you see something that works, better than the other stuff that's out there. And then quickly a lot of people converge on that approach. So ALZpath, again, has this particular anti-p-tau217 antibody that works particularly well. And I think another thing that differentiates us is that we are really interested in enabling as broad access as possible to p-tau217 tests. And so having an antibody can help make for less expensive and more scalable assays, these kinds of immunoassays. And so we license our antibody to lots of different companies for research use and for clinical use. And we want to make sure that we work as quickly as possible to get this new marker that seems to be better than the other markers that were bubbling around for a long time, and then build on that and be open to additional markers that bubble up to the top for the additional unmet needs in Alzheimer's diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of p-tau217 as the marker of focus, is this marker sufficient to be able to lead to a diagnosis, or is it used in combination to confirm via PET scan, CSF testing?
Yeah, I think that that the landscape is still developing in that area. So our antibody is available on several diagnostics platforms, and Quanterix is one of those, and then a diagnostics lab called Neurocode up in Washington State has taken that research use Quanterix assay and turned it into a lab-developed test. So it is available for physicians to order for testing for p-tau217. At the same time, we have licensed our antibody to a couple of clinical platforms. So Roche Diagnostics is using the ALZpath p-tau217 antibody and has announced breakthrough designation for their development of a blood-based Alzheimer's pathology test. And Beckman Coulter has also licensed it and just recently announced the research use only version of the ALZpath using p-tau217 assay on that clinical diagnostics platform. And so I think as those clinical diagnostics platforms launch products and they become more widely available and depending on exactly what the FDA labels, we hope they get FDA approved and what those labels look like, will determine the degree to which blood test is viewed as a screener that you use to identify patients that are likely to have Alzheimer's pathology. You then confirm with CSF or CSF or PET. I think that's the early stage, but we hope, and I think a lot of people hope, that over time, as people get more experience and see the concordance between the blood test and the CSF or PET test, and as the tests are made more and more robust, more and more widely available, more and more regulatory approval, that people in many cases will be able to use a blood test to confirm amyloid pathology. There's still other things important in the workup and diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, but for that confirmation of amyloid pathology, the hope is that blood will be sufficient and that the ALZpath using assays, using a small volume of blood widely available, can really help in that space.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that blood-based biomarker tests are the future of Alzheimer's disease diagnostics, or at least a core part?
I think that it's likely they are going to be pretty important, again, because of this, it's lower burden to the patient and cheaper and more widely available. So all of those things will help in the adoption of blood-based p-tau217. As I mentioned, there's lots of other parts of the diagnostic workup of Alzheimer's patients, and there's lots of other biomarkers out there. So imaging biomarkers are quite interesting because, you can see spatially where the pathology is, and you can measure different kinds of species. So an aggregated protein species in the brain with the PET ligand, for example, is a very different readout of the physiology than a blood test. There's also a lot of work being done with digital cognitive testing apps on people's phones or on the web or other formats to measure cognitive decline and see to catch patients early, for example, or to measure treatment effects using cognitive tests. And so I think those other, sometimes we call them modalities of biomarkers, are going to be important for research, basic research, therapeutic hypotheses, testing in clinical trials, and that it makes a lot of sense to have a wide range of biomarkers that are used in that research space as you get into the clinical space and thinking about scalability and access. I think blood tests would always be preferable, and the easier the better. In terms of both what the burden on the patient is, the costs to the healthcare system, the information that you get out, and how that can guide treatment. So all those things I think can kind of allow a lot of biomarkers to coexist, and then the most useful, impactful, and scalable ones to really make it out to the broadest population.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the p-tau217 biomarker, has this been developed to in terms of targeting, or in terms of really identifying specific patient populations, for example, those with early onset Alzheimer's? So where does this biomarker really kind of work best?
Yeah, I think we hope that that the ALZpath p-tau217 tests can help all kinds of Alzheimer's patients, or early onset or sporadic, later onset Alzheimer's disease, and so in all cases in the workup, you need a way to find out if a patient has amyloid pathology, and how is the amyloid pathology developing over time. And so I think it could be used widely.
Mm-hmm. And would that also include treatment monitoring to see how patients respond to Alzheimer's treatments as well?
Yeah, I think that is a hope, and there's been some data presented by the companies testing in the clinical trials for donanemab and lecanemab. There's some data has been shown that p-tau217 goes down, and that parallels what's seen by amyloid PET scans, where the those anti-amyloid antibodies clear plaque from the brain. Right. That's a sort of complex question of exactly how it would be used to guide treatment, and may be different for different antibody therapies. But I think there's potential there as well.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of ALZpath's pipeline, are there other biomarkers that the company is looking at, and also either as standalones or in combination with p-tau217?
Yeah, I think ALZpath has a kind of unique and interesting approach to this, which is we do most of the thinking and pursuing of additional biomarkers through collaboration and working with external folks, especially academic folks. We have a really helpful and scientifically strong scientific advisory board that helps us stay abreast of these things. I think we want to look for things that have a robust value on top of what you learn from p-tau217 about a patient, to address these sort of key unmet needs. So figure out what the unmet needs are in Alzheimer's diagnosis. If p-tau217 can do pretty good at detecting amyloid pathology, you need to think about what else do you need to know about a patient, and of course, prognosis is one very interesting possibility. So, of patients who are amyloid positive, which are going to be fast progressing or slow progressing, or how can you measure their progression? So predicting and measuring progression is a big unmet need, and we want to be open. We want to collaborate widely to find those biomarkers and evaluate them in the right cohorts, and look for things that bubble up, that have a big and very robust effect. And I think the last thing I'll say is, I'm very sensitive about, we don't want to have a not invented here mindset of trying to find it all ourselves. There's lots of people working in this field. got to stay on top of all of that and take advantage of whatever works best, agnostic to where it came from.
Indeed. And on that note, I think the industry definitely realizes today, perhaps more so than in the past, the importance of partnerships and collaborations. And so what are some, I know that you've mentioned a couple, but what are some of the pivotal ones that really are helping to drive ALZpath's work forward?
Yeah, and so I just joined last summer, so I wasn't involved in all these collaborations, but the previous folks at ALZpath worked with lots of academic groups from the University of Gothenburg, the Banner Institute, Wisconsin Alzheimer's cohort, and many other academic groups to get the ALZpath assay out onto these samples, and that allowed the evaluation of the performance and the understanding of what information the p-tau217 assay gives you. We've also had support from the ADDF Diagnostics Accelerator Group. It's been very helpful. And we also, have a collaboration with Neurocode, the lab I mentioned, that's offering the test as an LDT. So I've probably left a lot of people out in that list, but it has been very much a collaborative effort. And those are always the best kinds of things in science. So that's great. We hope to do many more of them in the future.
And in terms of technology, I think that's really the driving force behind a lot of advancements that we're seeing in the field. And in your opinion, what are sort of the current trends or technological advancements, or maybe non-technological advancements as well, just in terms of mindsets and approaches to Alzheimer's diagnostics currently and in the next, let's say, couple of years, 5 to 10 years? Where do you see the field heading in terms of technological and non-technological advancements, and what are you most excited about?
Yeah, I think one thing I would flag is the need for sort of very high sensitivity assays. So, ALZpath has partnered with Quanterix and the Simoa platform for the p-tau217 assay. And we've also are partnered with Alamar and the new Lyza platform, and then also Biotechne and the Ella platform as microfluidics platform. And so making sure that that especially for detection in blood, that you have the option of these very high sensitivity assays to sort of figure out early on, is this something promising? And then on some of the higher throughput and more clinical platforms, you might be able to push the sensitivity wherever you discover you need it to be, but you might not. You have to figure out if you have something promising first and how much you need to push it. So I think there's always going to be a need for these sort of very high sensitivity platforms, especially in the research and discovery space. And there's several options out there, so that's great. I would say, the other very interesting area of technology is in the idea of multiplexing and looking at groups of biomarkers together. And then lastly, I think everyone feels like, digital assessments and potentially the use of machine learning and training of models based on large data sets from assessments of large numbers of people combined with these sensitive assays could solve some of the problems. But, there's the devil will be in the details on how all those things come together over the next few years, but based on the work of a very large body of research in this area.
And in terms of just staying on top and abreast, of really a very, I guess, complex and competitive landscape, how does ALZpath, or what is the company's approach to really, I wouldn't say staying ahead of the competition or anything, but just really to lead the field, and what is really that kind of approach or again, I think I've said mindset quite a lot, but I think it really does require that. But in terms of just approaching challenges in the field, again, working on such a complex disease.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's important for us to be successful in that area. I mean, again, we have this great scientific advisory board that helps. We have a good antibody, and that's a sort of foot in the door. And so, we that can enable us to sort of we can bring something to the table, um, and hopefully get involved in the right conversations to learn about things that are emerging and how they might combine with p-tau217, for example. And then the last thing, I would say is you really have to just stay up in the field and be open to ideas from wherever they come, and kind of keep your eye on the clinical problem you're trying to solve. And then try to just triage things as quickly as possible. Does this help? Does this help? Does that help? And it's going to be just a game of testing it, efficiently and holding out for the stuff that's really impactful.
Mm-hmm. And you did touch on this in terms of the importance of access, and I think that really stands out with ALZpath. And so what really is the approach to ensuring that patients have access to this test in terms of it being widely available across clinics and also being cost effective and being affordable and being the insurance coverages and all of that plays into things with the U.S. Health insurance industry.
Yeah, and I think, from an ALZpath point of view, we're trying to, we have this non-exclusive licensing model, so we want to get it onto as many clinical platforms as possible and help those clinical platforms succeed. And I think the more you have out there, the better that can be for payers in terms of access and then ultimately also for patients. And so, we rely on our partners to work through those processes and the approvals necessary but the idea of continuing to see how, what are the bottlenecks for people getting access to testing? What is needed for testing and what's holding people back, and then see if we can find places there where we can help out. So, I hope we can continue to do that with launches this year, hopefully, of some of the clinical tests, and then continuing on from there in subsequent years.
Yep, and that's a great segue into my last question in terms of what can we expect from ALZpath in the coming months and years, important milestones that we can look out for.
Yeah, and this is, I want to be clear that we don't speak for our partners. Both Beckman and Roche are, we hope will have announcements on their progress toward FDA-approved tests using our antibody this year. Again, Beckman just had an announcement about the research use only form being available. We also hope that, we can, through labs running lab-developed tests in this period before there are FDA-approved tests, that we can expand clinical access in that way as well. And then, in subsequent years, we want to understand how p-tau217 and perhaps other biomarkers can enable prevention trials and ultimately prevention treatment and increased access that will be needed for catching patients before they have symptoms, before they go into the doctor's office with memory complaints, in the setting where there are effective prevention therapies, there's going to be the need for even greater access and reliable testing for amyloid pathology and potentially other markers that are prognostic in that setting.
And I think lastly, I just want to ask in terms of, really keeping the patient at the center of all of these innovations and advancements, and really how does ALZpath approach that? And if you have patients out there or caregivers listening, our base is largely industry, but we also have patients and caregivers as important stakeholders in all of this. And so what should they know about how this particular test can be game changing, and how does this go full circle in terms of, I think you started off by sharing a personal story. And so how do you see the shift in the landscape today with things like diagnostic testing and with the test that ALZpath has to offer?
Yeah, I think, it's the world is starting to change on the, detection and treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And I'm sympathetic to patients and their families who are trying to, be at the cutting edge of what is very much an evolving landscape. And I think it's going to get better pretty quickly in terms of these tests being more widely available. Again, they're available in lab-developed test form right now, but that's not widely used. It may become more widely used, especially as treatments become more established and accepted as effective, and just to help patients understand to get to the conversation where they can discuss the treatments and their risks and benefits. The diagnosis is the first part of that. So we want to see if we can make that easier and faster in general, whether it's through LDTs or through approved tests. I think that, again, the hope is, there will be additional therapies and we'll move towards prevention. And then that's really where, I think we want to make progress as fast as possible, because I think that's where we have the greatest chance to really help patients and their families, delaying the onset or maybe preventing the onset of Alzheimer's disease. And that is, requires many, many things to come together. But that's the first glimpse since I've been in the field that we might get to that. So that's very encouraging. I guess it's a sort of hopeful message in the end.
Indeed, it definitely is. Dr. Honigberg, I'd like to thank you so much for being on the show today and for sharing your insights, your journey, and really the tremendous work that you're helping lead at ALZpath.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Likewise. That's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.
To join the Xtalks community, visit Xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.